to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Hello, Zero Books readers and viewers. It's me again, Douglas Lain. I'm here with my Karl Marx, my Groucho Marx shirt, and Ashley Frawley. Ashley is the author of The Semiotics of Happiness and a reader at Zero Books and a university lecturer. Is that right? And an all-around great woman to have on your team. Today we're going to discuss debating reactionaries, mindfulness, and cancel culture. So I hope that we can cover all of that. Ashley, thanks for coming on the live stream.
Thanks for having me.
So what happened last night, to just fill you in, is I debated a guy named Stefan Molyneux, who some people describe as a fascist. Some people describe him as a cult leader. He describes himself, I'm not sure how he describes himself exactly, but he's kind of a self-help guru, anti-Marxist, race realist, bald man. And I spent about 2 hours debating him, and he has theatrical training. So he was quite good at just sort of pontificating non-answers to things. And he kind of wore me down, I have to say, at the end. And he sprung a quote from Engels on me, which I hadn't encountered before, about how we had to wipe out all the reactionaries, and for generations there'll be no more reactionaries left when we're done with them. It was written in 1848.
Anytime anybody wants to misrepresent Marxism, just toss in a quote from Engels.
Well, it was written during the European revolutions of 1848, when they were being slaughtered and by counter-revolutionary forces.
And that's also what Lenin was responding to with the he was looking at Marx and Engels' understanding of the Paris Commune, of the fact that they were just slaughtered.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, I don't think I did too poorly. I do think it was sort of a crap fest. I was going to say something else, and but so I guess I want to start by asking you, what do you think the merit is in debating people who are maybe acting in bad faith, who don't really engage in argumentation very well, and who have far-right reactionary or even fascist politics? Do you think there is any merit in that?
I'm surprised that he was willing to actually have a debate. Usually they don't want to. In fact, I'm pretty sure that actual fascists forbade their followers from having debates. Mm-hmm. So it's not that that's quite surprising. I think generally the trouble is when you have a debate with somebody like that is that you're coming from such incredibly different positions, and you also have an idea in your mind of what that other person's position is, which is inevitably distorted. Mm-hmm. And so that makes it very, very difficult to have a discussion, because you're kind of talking past each other. I think that's what happened when you and I and Nikos Sotirakopoulos spoke to each other. I have this idea of what he's all about. And he knows what I'm all about, because we read Capital together.
Right.
So I kept saying, "Oh, you think it's this equilibrium," and he was like, "I never said anything about equilibrium."
Right.
But that's what winds up happening. So it's very, very difficult to find a starting point, some kind of common ground that you can go from, because we want to start historically, because mm-hmm. obviously we're historical materialists, and they want to start with ideals.
Right.
And perhaps that's a good place to start, because then you can trace the ideals back. I mean, it's a tough thing to do, but I think it's an important thing to do. Probably doesn't work as a verbal debate. But if you take people at their word and you study what they say, mm-hmm. And try to find the coherence within it, which is, when I say coherence, I don't mean that it's correct.
Right.
Even like witchcraft amongst the Azandi is coherent. It can't possibly be correct, but it coheres. It has a logic. then that's a very good starting point for our side, for our understanding of what these ideas are trying to explain, where they're coming from, what spurs their logic on. And then you trace it back historically, and somehow you find some kind of truth, I think. So like, for instance, like everything that I do, all of my studies are studies of ideas I don't like.
Right.
And I go in depth trying to find out what it is, what this discourse is, what this thing is, before I launch into debate against it. And often what I find is that I don't have to debate it. I can undermine it by showing what it is. I can challenge it by showing it what it is. In fact, that's what I often say to my PhD students when they first start. They're often driven by this desire to disprove something. They hate it. They don't like it. They want to argue with it. And so they'll write me these literature reviews that are just them arguing against the literature. And I say, no, you do that eventually, but you challenge it by showing what it is. Right. And so I think that's probably one of the more powerful ways to do that. But that's obviously like a one-sided thing. But that's a way of engaging with these ideas instead of just ignoring them. So like happiness discourses, I think, are engaging with something real, but they're trying to harmonize it.
Right. And if I were to critique myself, and I will, on with Stefan, one of the things I could have done and should have done was spend a lot more time than I did looking into his work and tracing back his influences. And one of the weaknesses I think maybe Stefan and I both have is that we were both kind of coming at this in a philosophical way. I mean, I went through the philosophy department at my university rather than a historical way. And so for me, I have a tendency to kind of gravitate towards these sort of abstract arguments. And that's not always to my advantage. But I do think that it was worthwhile just kind of in this moment to still have these conversations and to try to improve your performance and the style of the debates in online spaces. For me, the big thing I did, he's the guy, if you don't know who he is, he's the guy who kind of got famous for saying, not an argument. That's not an argument. So I kept trying to give him real, just concise, like little syllogisms, to get him in real arguments. And I found that when I did that, he would tell me stories instead of engaging with what I actually said. So he would just start.
Oh, that's very effective. I used to be a drama teacher, which is why I'm like so animated, and probably why I do well on supposedly do well on TV. I studied drama for a long time, and one thing that's really important and powerful when you do that kind of thing is storytelling. That's also in a good way, right? So storytelling is like, part of growing up and that kind of thing. It's the natural thing to do, and it is very, very effective. The problem, of course, is when that's all there is, when all you have is rhetoric, all you have are stories that are engaging and capture people and are just hand waving, or there's a kind of surface level thing. I think there are a lot of public figures that I like that are very good storytellers, very engaging speakers, but the coherence of their ideologies is all very, very superficial. Tells a nice story, sort of just so story. Everything is the way that it is because lobster something.
Right, exactly.
And they'll go to evolutionary psychology or something and make this big leap to human society today, forgetting all the variation that exists in human societies and so on.
Right, but my weakness maybe was I didn't counter with my own stories, but I felt as though when you're working on the level of just stories, all you're going to do is keep your audience. You're not going to reach the other side. Maybe I'm wrong. But definitely lessons to learn from these encounters. But just sort of more broadly, do you feel as though maybe we're getting to a point, maybe it's just in my own mind, but where this taboo against debate, this taboo against, engaging the other side is falling apart, that the left is at least it seems like in America it's sort of shifting now, maybe due to the Sanders campaign and some of the things that are kind of being revealed in this moment. Or let me explain what I mean. When you have someone like Sanders running for the presidency, and the people who are most vocal about trying to condemn these sorts of debates or discourse and trying to control speech are using those same techniques against Sanders. It becomes more clear what these sort of language policing games or discourse policing games are all about. But do you think that's going to be received by people?
Well, I think we've seen the end results of trying to no platform and trying to cancel people and so on. I mean, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work. It creates heroes out of what would have been petty criminals. Writing an article at the moment about cancel culture as medieval punishment, rehashing medieval forms of punishment. And that was one of the things that medieval punishment accidentally did. These great big public spectacles of torturing and executing people. They were supposed to underscore the power of the sovereign, right? You know, challenging a law was like challenging the power of the sovereign. But what they wound up doing was they created this kind of carnivalesque space betwixt and between, you know, outside of the rules, where the dead man who has nothing to lose suddenly starts to say the unsayable, to criticize the king, God, you know, everything. And so we cast these people out of society, and suddenly we create this group of people who are able and allowed and have license to say the unsayable. But also, you create heroes out of petty criminals. So that's what would happen, you know, during medieval punishment. They would tell these stories of people who hadn't really done anything particularly special, but in the great spectacle of the things that they said, their repentance or lack thereof became very powerful. And they were the sought after stories and were replaced eventually with the whole crime drama genre. So I think, and what happened was eventually they realized that these great spectacles were doing the exact opposite of what they had intended to do. They were not underscoring the power of the sovereign. They were turning people into heroes, but also they were, to some extent, empowering the mass, because the power of the sovereign was enacted through the crowd. But never do we feel closer to the person on the scaffold than at that moment, right? The idea is this could be you, so don't break the law. But we're all thinking that could be me. So you have this closeness with that person, and it creates this sense of solidarity. And so very quickly in the 19th century, they started to say, maybe it shouldn't be spectacle. Maybe it should just be punishment.
Right. Yeah. Hang them in a quiet little room somewhere, and then just tell everyone they're dead. Don't put on a big public display. Yeah. I feel as though one of the things that strikes me, and this just comes to mind as you talk, but so bear with me as I try to work it out. But it seems to me that, for instance, the Bernie bro myth and all the concern about toxic behavior from Bernie bros online, and you know, the New York Times writing about Chapo Trap House, this culturally this symptom of cultural decline and the baseness of Bernie supporters. All of it seems to me to show incredible weakness from the establishment, that they're horrified by Chapo Trap House, and some people tweeting, you know, snake emojis at Elizabeth Warren is somehow, you know, a terrible crime, or you know, makes them clutch their pearls. But so far that seems to be, at least to some extent, working against Sanders. But I do wonder if it's going to build solidarity amongst people who are coming through this moment, and make the movement that will go beyond Sanders maybe more powerful. I hope so.
Well, I think nothing is more exciting these days than watching a head-to-head intellectual debate, and that's got to be a good thing. I mean, how many people waited outside for hours to see Zizek versus Peterson. And, you know, ultimately these debates are always going to be a bit unsatisfying. But we move forward, I think, a little bit every time we do that. And knowing that your arguments will always be tested by the opposition is an important part of developing your own side's arguments. You know, I'm sure like you've probably thought about that argument, that debate many times since you closed down the call and thought, yeah, I wish I would have said that. Next time I'm going to say that. Or I didn't have a response for that. I'm going to go home and I'm going to think of something better to say. And I know there's an answer to that. I'm going to read into that. So it progresses you.
I don't know with Stefan if that's actually the case, but
I haven't been able to see it back.
Yeah, but with in general, yes, that is my reaction when I guess the one point I think that he kind of got me on was the question of revolutionary violence, and
Right.
I've thought about what my response was, and he kind of pushed me into a corner because he asked one question. He sort of tricked me. He asked one question: will I condemn Marxist violence, you know, or far left violence? And I said, sure, absolutely. And I meant now, right? Today, people who are organizing for socialism should not be engaged in red terror.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not 1933. Like,
yeah, it's not a good strategy right now. And it also doesn't have a great track record on its own of leading anywhere. At least, you know, not immediately. I don't think that it's necessary. I can't say that for certain, right?
No.
But what that got
there's no
into,
organization, so there's absolutely no necessity of violence. Like all it can do is alienate people.
Right. Well, but what that got turned into was the question of whether I would condemn all of Marxism for being an ideology of violence. And it's like, which that I had to reject, of course, because that's not what Marxism is, and you know, clearly he didn't know what he was talking about. But what I had to consider was, well, what is it that is being asked about when I'm asked to condemn violence? What's actually going on there? And obviously, today people are okay with violence. Ultimately, people are okay with violence because we live in an incredibly violent world. The state is very violent.
They're okay with the state monopoly on violence.
Right. The state monopoly on violence and the kind of indirect violence of mass poverty or, you know, mass health care denial. You know, we're okay with the prospects of even a pandemic due to the failure of this system to adequately provide testing in the United States, for instance. No one's out in arms in the street, and there you go, in arms, you know, condemning the violence of this system. Which, but somehow all of those kinds of comments don't seem quite adequate to wrestle with the question of how do you use force to achieve freedom, or can you use force to achieve mass freedom? And it's something that I haven't fully worked out for myself. And
well, it's probably not a question that you can actually decide in the abstract. You can't sit there and go, yeah, I'm prepared. Like, you don't. We are not at that historical juncture. We are not there. It's like it's a pointless conversation to have, because when that question arises, and in a serious way, you would be in a position. And if you think about it historically, when that question arose, so in the 1930s in Spain, for example, this is in a situation where there is a very, very violent fascist repression and an organized response to that tries to overthrow it. In that situation, violence becomes a pragmatic question. And you can't sit there and say, oh, I commit to nonviolence and then just be slaughtered, right? So that's the kind of situation. It's a pragmatic one. It may be that the way that capitalism takes us somehow does not require violence to push it over into something new. I doubt that. What will probably happen is there would be another war. And if people were organized enough, then it might become a pragmatic question again. I don't know. I have no idea. These are historical questions that have to be decided at the historical moment, and in relation to the factors that are present at that time.
Yeah, I totally agree with all that.
And at our time, it is not necessary, and it is and it is ridiculous to think you would just be LARPing revolutionary, like LARPing 1917 or the 1930s. I mean, and that is very dangerous.
Yeah, I think my real mistake at that point in the conversation, when he was asking me how would I imagine that the workers could achieve the seizure of the means of production and the transformation of the means of production into a new form of economic and social reality. When he was asking me that, I should have admitted to not knowing. I should have admitted to my ignorance, because I don't know exactly how that would be worked out. And whatever practical advice I might have offered was going to be inadequate. And what I should have done, and if I ever debate someone like that again, what I will do is just say, look, I don't have all the answers for how to achieve socialism. If I did, I would have done it already. Like what I'm doing is trying to bring this problem to people, bring the problem of capitalist society and the need for a transformation to people, and hope that as more and more people come together, that both the popular support and understanding of the problem and the kind of the brain power that's brought to bear will lead to some, transformation.
I don't think that's possible. I don't think that will ever happen, if I'm honest. No, because I think that there's likely to be some moment where it just becomes where the knowledge becomes important is that there's a moment where there's an ideological warfare that says all of these excess people, access to capital, are just like a scourge on the planet and just parasites and all that, which we already have that rhetoric. And yet you have this whole world of wealth easily produced, kept behind walls, kept away from, desperately trying to beat these people back, trying to keep people away from these grand machines of mass production that we have. One would hope that we would be able to win against that ideological onslaught against humanity, but it wouldn't only be ideological. I mean, it would have to be a mass of people organized. And the thing is, capitalism already does that. It already organizes people into violent masses in war and military. And so, for example, in Russia in 1917, the people were already organized by the imperialist war. And so that question became quite pragmatic. It wasn't about assembling, soldiers. They were already more or less assembled. And same, I think the same in Spain. I mean, people were already more or less assembled. Now, I don't know the exact sort of, I'm obviously not like a historian, but the general outlook is that capitalism does that already. And it organizes us to engage its own violent wars. Then it becomes a pragmatic question of, can we flip that? Can we not engage in that war and engage in one for us, and to fight the capitalists back? I think that might become pragmatic. I think that might become what happens in the future. I'm not sure. I think that's the most likely thing. It's much more likely that we will be organized in enormous militaries to fight against each other, than it is that we will, through the sheer brilliance of our minds, which I do think human minds are brilliant, but I also think that there's extraordinary interests at play that will fight with everything they have to hold on to their power, to hold on to their advantage. About violence as well, like Lenin says that when people say, like, look around, everything's peaceful, it's wonderful. And he says there's this underlying violence that always exists to maintain the appearance of peace. So there are people who are like busted down all on the borders of the EU right now. Look around, everything's wonderful. Look at all these white people. It's so great. Oh, and isn't it sad that white people can't move around the EU anymore? And then you've got this awful fortress all the way around the EU that maintains the appearance of that peace by beating people down, shooting at little rafts with people on it, like people drowning in the Mediterranean. 20,000 people have drowned in the Mediterranean in the last 6 years. That is the violence that upholds the appearance of peace. And so it's not that there's this wonderful, peaceful society that communists are trying to disrupt. It's, Lenin says, when revolutionary violence breaks out, it's the disruption of the appearance of peace where violence that already exists breaks out into the open. And I would say probably France is an example of that at the moment, that violence of pushing people down, accept this, and people won't take it anymore. And then that violence breaks out into open violence.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything that you've said so far. And I think what I said before sounded like I was arguing for volunteerism or in a very kind of naive let's kumbaya, let's all hold hands and march on Washington together kind of idea. I didn't quite mean that, but I did mean that in the debates, when I'm debating someone like Molyneux, that rather than presenting some concrete plan, what I want to do is present the idea of the problem, so that when the contradictions within capitalism and the underlying violence breaks out, people have at least some people are aware of what's going on to the best of their ability, and are prepared to act and thinking together. And in the conditions they're in. But I do think that what you were describing almost sounds like a kind of economic determinism, not just economic, but sort of determinism of the capitalist dynamic, where we are just swept along by history and then find ourselves acting almost automatically. And I think that I don't think that's what you mean either. So the question here is, how do we overcome this dilemma in our thinking, which really probably isn't in the world, and put our ideas into action as we're moved by material forces?
Well, we engage with the reality of capital every day, and this reality is reflected in our minds. And we act on the world, we try to change it, we see what works and what doesn't. And that is what people do. That is the way that ideas and action are dialectical, right? So I'm just saying that this is, if you understand the economic trends, and what winds up happening is, if people are no longer able to eat or to feed their families, if there's nothing left for them, they will act. They will do something. No amount of ideology at that point is going to stop people. I mean, it's very, very hard to get people to act against their own economic interests to a significant degree. I mean, you can do it, and religion is a pretty good way of doing that. There are lots of ideologies that can get people to enact extraordinary self-sacrifice. But at the end of the day, on the whole, if you deprive people of their means of subsistence and there's nothing they can do, there's nothing for them, they will leave. They will try to go somewhere where they can find work or a way to feed their families or whatever, or they will riot. And that's I'm not saying anything particularly controversial there. I think the CIA has 4 points of 4 conditions that will lead to unrest, and that's one of them. And it's also a lot of young men without hope.
Yeah, but those, all of what you're describing, I absolutely agree. It's the natural consequence of deprivation, but it isn't revolutionary violence. It isn't even or nonviolence. It's not a revolutionary transformation for people to riot because they don't have food.
Yeah.
And so it has to be a moment where something like a riot over food might break out, but also a deeper understanding has already taken hold of people, so that they can act, not just to protest the lack of food, not just to maybe riot and raid the food stores, but to take power and transform it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the tricky thing. And the other thing I would point out is, like, in the 60s in America and in Europe too, it wasn't deprivation but affluence that led to a lot of revolutionary fervor. The students in Berkeley in 1964 through 68, or the students in Paris, they were not starving. And in fact, a lot of the people involved were looking ahead to relatively comfortable lives. But the problem was that they felt as though they had all this abundance and a society that was promising to be free, but they were still basically in chains. They didn't have a future worth living, but they had a future that was, relatively comfortable, they thought. So I don't know if we can clearly say whether or not immiseration alone would.
Oh, no. My point about immiseration was about economic determinism. Like, just to point out that there are deeper forces that underlie much historical movement. So if you think about immigration today, people are desperately trying to say that this is like an individual phenomenon. They're saying it's traffickers, and it's like, yeah, okay, if it was like a few people, you would say it's traffickers, but it's thousands upon thousands of people there. There are very clearly strong pushes here. And it's hard to understand when you're in that historical moment, but with historical hindsight, you can see very clearly. So for instance, like, vagrancy. I'm not sure if you're familiar with laws that a successive cascade of laws that outlawed vagrants. So you had the enclosures, you pushed the peasants off the land, and they started to come into the cities. And people were looking around and going, where are all these people coming from? They're these vagrants. And they're like, it's the tea, it's the tea. It's making them soft, And so they have all these successively more draconian laws against vagrancy. So it's from whipping to execution. So they keep sending them back, but they have nowhere to go, so they keep coming back into the cities. So eventually, it's a very good solution to quote unquote overpopulation is just kill people, just execute them. And with historical hindsight, we can see that no amount of deterrence, no amount of harsh penalty or control was going to make those sheep pastures back into communal land. So there was this and the flow of gold and precious metals that was coming into Europe, which was the even deeper underlying force for that. And the people coming into the cities was a symptom of that. And we can see that now, but you're trying to stop it at the level of the person coming into the city, when the cause or the process is so far back, so much deeper. So that's what I'm trying to say about economic determinism. It's that there are often very, very deep pushes that lead people to migrate, and no amount of deterrence or talking about our wonderful European community and our values and blah 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 is going to stop that. And we better have an honest conversation that control means violence. if you want to talk about how he doesn't believe in violence, well, the upkeep of this beautiful, peaceful society we're living in is horrific violence.
Right. Yeah, and if I was Stefan Molyneux, I would just tell you a story about how when I was a teenager, I went and got my first job, and it was fair, and I had a good boss, and society it works great, and and
I'll tell you a story about 18-month-olds getting fished out of the Mediterranean. Are you prepared? Yeah. What level of job security, is necessary for you to accept that as a consequence?
Yeah. See, why am I reluctant to make that move that you just talked about? Because I absolutely.
I have a soul, Doug.
No, but I mean, I think it's absolutely a fair one, and it's a natural one. But what bothers me about meeting someone who's saying, "Well, look, I got a good job, and I got ahead, and my relationship with my boss was fine," and I'm reluctant to then turn around and say, well, what about these people over there? Not because I don't think that's the right reaction, but because I want to bring this person into I don't want to condemn the person for feeling like their life was good. I just want to bring them in to think through the logical implications of the society they're in, rather than say, because my response will be, look, I understand that sometimes you can go to work and you can have a nice boss, but if you take a step back and look at the total picture, in a society where some people have nothing to sell but their labor, obviously you're going to set up a class dynamic, which in the case with Stefan Molyneux, his priority was free expression and free speech and all that. And so you're obviously going to create conditions where a lot of people are incentivized not to think and not to critique and not to freely express themselves when they have to ingratiate themselves to a class of people who own the means of production. So if you care about free speech, you must care about overcoming class. And that was my response to that, rather than to say, well, think about the people fished out of the Mediterranean, and I guess maybe that's the fact that I don't experience the deaths of people trying to flee, refugees, directly, but I'm not sure if that's it. I think that I just don't like trading morality tales with
well, no,
people.
you might start with some kind of injustice, that there's something there, but you don't end there, right? It's always going to be weak if you just say that's it, right? You're like, now I do think that there should never be a world in which that's okay. I'm obviously like a mother, and when I see pictures like that, I see my family there because we're immigrants, right? And there just can't be a world in which it's okay that many people drown and that they will take their children on their backs and try to swim across a river. Sorry.
Yeah, I know. I know.
You start with that, right? But then you go deeper and you use your capacity for reason to understand why that is happening, because no reasonable person is going to do that because it sounds like a fun time. Like there's something.
Right. No, I know.
When there are that many people, there's something going on that is much, much deeper, that the surface level doesn't capture, that even that violence that we see when it washes up on the shore doesn't capture. And that is that deeper movement of human beings around the world. And what are those pushes? And then when you understand that, you'll know that it's those laws which we think are the solution that are the reason ultimately why we have that awful violence, because we're not penetrating deeper. So you start with those stories, but you move back, and that's the sociological imagination, is understanding the relationship between individual stories and life and biography and the bigger movements of history. And that used to be very much in demand, and that's more or less gone now. We're just left with that surface level. Think of the children. Yes, I say think of the children, but I think why? Why? Why is that happening? And, in some of the last things that Karl Marx wrote, I just happened to be reading some of his last letters. That's what he was talking about. He was going to do this big study. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. He was going to do this big study where he was going to try to talk to working people and basically do a social survey, what we would understand now as a survey of the problems that they understand in the workplace. And and Engels, obviously, his work on the condition of the working class, all of these things are really, really important. And Marx sees that. He sees that injustice, and then he pushes back all the way so that capital doesn't start with these atrocity tales, even though that is actually the starting point of the research. It starts with value. It starts with that cell of society from which all of these things emanate, and that's our task. But we don't just ignore the atrocities and the injustice. That's the thing that directs us to the thing that needs to be studied and understood.
Yeah, I know. And I guess maybe my problem is, or maybe what's moving me to try to talk in rational terms, or, take that big picture approach first, is my experience in activism, going back to, let's say, 9/11, and the failures I had then when I was trying to convince people that the famine in Afghanistan was going to be so severely exacerbated by the bombings and the invasion and the war in Afghanistan that to go down this road of a military solution to terrorism was just monstrous, and I would find pictures of the refugees and people starving and the consequences in Afghanistan, and try to bring this up to people. And the reaction I got, especially in that moment, was just a very thorough rejection and anger from people, where I found that if I was a bit more successful, if I started with, listen, here's your interests, you'd like to see these terrorist attacks end, I would too. This approach that we're taking isn't going to work. This is going to make the problem worse. Let me explain. At least then I would have a conversation rather than just an emotional reaction. So
yeah, I think it's a double-edged sword. You have to be very careful, because obviously we're all, there's every single day, people are exhausted by the atrocity tales just constantly coming at them, and you just kind of shut down and you go, oh, another person trying to tell me the world's coming to an end. Please, I've had enough. And so if you come at it from a different, from more of like the logic of the situation, I think that's a lot more effective. So yeah, it is a double-edged sword, and I think it's probably the immigration issue that I find to be the most interesting in terms of my distaste for emotionalization of social problems. Because, like, obviously, I don't think it's just, I don't think in understanding the situation in any kind of emotional sense is helpful. But I think that I don't know, maybe it's just me, but that pang of like horror that I feel.
Not just you. It's not just you.
Is that sense of humanity, that there is something wrong here, that I'm supposed to understand that these people are different from me and therefore can be subject to different laws, or different levels of humanity.
I don't think it's you at all. And I think it's an absolutely valid and necessary, like, human response to that kind of tragedy and horrible suffering and unnecessary death, especially of children. But one thing that I've noticed in myself is I'm 49 now, Ashley. I'm getting up there. And one thing that I've noticed is that I can't really thoroughly and fully trust my emotional responses, because I will sometimes tear up while watching a commercial. Something hormonal is going on. I don't know what's going on. My masculine repression of my emotions is shriveling up as I get into the middle age.
And I have to be careful about that too, because I always say, like, my first reaction is usually wrong. Like, whenever I always think, oh no, somebody's trying to pull a fast one on me here. Right. So I'm all, I always, anytime that you have a strong emotional response to something, you have to kind of think critically, what's going on here? Where did this video come from? What am I being asked to believe? But I think, like, that as much as I have looked into the immigration issue, that horror has never gone away. And in fact, it only gets worse.
Yeah, I mean, when you do take a step back from your first response and you think it through, and your emotional response and horror sort of deepens and becomes contextualized, then you're onto something. And I think that what you described about the fortress around Europe and the people, thousands of people drowning. I mean, that's a vivid picture, and it's absolutely true. And the more you look into it, the more true that's going to seem.
And people will, like, there's, for every argument that people make, there's a logical response to it that isn't, that it has nothing to do with the emotional response. So people will say, like, oh, send them back to their own country so they can solve the problems. Well, they try that, and then our governments kill them, or, topple their governments. It's every time that you try to solve it, it just gets deeper and deeper and deeper.
Do you think if people were just, like, in all these different governments or different parts of the world, would just take a moment to be more mindful that these problems. This is my segue.
Yeah.
That these problems would become ameliorated. That we would overcome them. But no, I want to just give you a moment to talk. How much more time do you have, by the way?
About 35 minutes.
Okay, so let's talk for about 5 to 10 minutes here about mindfulness and the way that psychological approaches are deployed to try to solve social problems, and maybe some of the time the people who are pushing these solutions are conniving enough to know that they're actually just pushing a distraction from the solution to social problems. But tell me a little bit about the mindfulness industry and how it's been created and deployed in the last few years.
Okay, so I did this study with I've been doing this sort of very large study of mindfulness as this sort of wave in social problems, the sort of newest or fairly new fad that's come about. So I looked at self-esteem, happiness, well-being. I've been looking at mindfulness within that, and then mental health, which is what I'm looking into right now. And so I did this very large sort of study of Anglophone discourses of mindfulness in Anglophone newspapers. So I looked at Australia, Canada, the United States, and the UK. And I did quite a big in-depth study of the UK, which I'm not finished writing up, but the Anglophone one, where we traced the whole sort of trajectory of where mindfulness came from and what it became, and a little bit about the story that it tells about social problems. That paper I wrote with my co-author, Daniel Naring, and it's coming out in the journal Sociology of Health and Illness in a couple months. It's just accepted. So what we argue in that paper is that the success of mindfulness as this discourse that promises the amelioration in a very interesting way, by the way, which I'll come to. It doesn't exactly promise to solve problems, which is very interesting in terms if you compare it to self-esteem and happiness and so on before it. But what it says about the cultural outlook that we have on social problems today, and it basically represents this inversion of C. Wright Mell's sociological imagination. And what we do is we pull out three tenets of the sociological imagination, and we compare it to this, what we think of as this sort of emergent psychological understanding of social problems. And I mean that in the cultural sense, psychological and the sort of broader cultural uses of psychology. So for Mills, the sociological imagination promises the treatment of private troubles as public issues. It's problem-driven, independent research. So ideally, it's by the researcher who's interested in some issue and pursues it out of interest and isn't beholden to funders and so on. And interestingly, toward the end of his book on the sociological imagination, which was published in 1959, so it's very old, but it's considered a foundational text in the social sciences. He talks about freedom and reason, that the point of the social sciences is the furthering of reason and human freedom in society. And it's interesting because that's the least resilient conclusion that he draws. So by comparison, the psychological imagination sees public issues as private troubles that are ultimately rooted in individual psychology, individual behavior, individual inability to quite understand or control one's own emotions. And so that are sort of isolable at that individual level. It fetishizes methodological complexity. So, for instance, in like happiness discourses, there was this very famous drama that erupted around this woman, Barbara Fredrickson's work on what she called a positivity ratio. So she used these very complex equations that all look very impressive. And, this was published and it was cited like 300 times, and it spawned this whole industry. And then finally, one day, this engineering student or this engineer decides to go and study psychology, and he's sitting in the lecture and he sees these complex equations and he goes, this is all nonsense. And it was this big scandal. It was revealed that actually the equations had nothing, were totally senseless. Anyway, so that's methodological complexity. They're sort of enamored by the appearance of science, and they'll like create these like
was that how did
graphs and stuff.
How did that system of these equations, this big methodology, emerge? Did the person who created that system kind of know that it was a sham, or was there some key idea that just if you pulled on that string, then the whole thing collapsed? Or
well, the way that she tells the story, she met her co-author, and he said she was talking about this qualitative research that she had done, and he said, oh, you know, we could probably use this this particular approach to examining the data. And she thought it was fascinating and so on. She never really understood the equations, and I'm sure she's very annoyed with her co-author for, I don't know, he must have known that it was inapplicable, that you couldn't use that to analyze that particular data. But she was just so enamored by the appearance of science, as was everybody else who cited that paper, that it sort of snowballed.
Wow.
So that's methodological complexity and service to bureaucracy. So what happens is, if you want to do these really methodologically complex studies, they're very expensive, and you need funding for that. And when you get funding, you have to promise certain things. You have to promise you're going to solve all these problems. This is why I'm never able to get funding, because I refuse to say I'm going to solve any problem, and I'm not going to come up with some psychological intervention or something like that. I want to show where this discourse came from, and no funder is particularly interested in that, at least not yet. So you have this service to bureaucracy. What winds up happening is, the more expensive the studies, the more in service you are to the problems that bureaucracy throws up. So we've got this problem of people going off work for, you know, work-related stress. Go, okay, I'm going to come up with this new intervention, right? And so this is a humongous problem generally in the academy. We have a ton of like advocacy research that's, you know, there are very few people. I notice on social media, people throw around the word grifter a lot. You know, nobody, like very few people are not grifters anymore. Like you are trying to get, you need to get funding. And in some universities, the pressure for funding is so great that it's caused suicides. That you have to pay your own salary basically with funders, with the money. So there's an enormous pressure. And when you promise to do studies for funders, often they have particular objectives. And there's also a push for evidence-based policy. And the old joke is policy-based evidence. Like, they have a policy and they're like, who will give us the evidence for it? And people are like, I will. So there's a lot of that going on. And then the end result, so where Mills thought that the purpose of the social sciences was furthering human freedom and reason, the end taken for granted goal of the psychological imagination is well-being. And I would add to that, I didn't write it in this paper, but I've since realized that it's not just well-being, but it's well-being and safety. And so that becomes like the rationale for all sorts of discourses, is that it will make us psychologically secure. We will have this sense of well-being. And I keep saying this, but freedom is no longer an ideal, it becomes a problem. If safety is the ideal, freedom is a problem. Other people's freedom potentially infringes on the safety and well-being of others. So this is the sort of psychological imagination that we describe in this paper, that we've sort of that emerges out of our study of mindfulness, and the sort of story that we see play out in these mindfulness discourses, which is they're very enamored with methodological complexity. They'll talk about brain scans, and they'll use a lot of language from neuroscience, some intentionally obfuscating sort of language. They will often say it is deceptively simple, because it is very simple. But then they'll say, but there's all this science behind it. So it's highly scientized, but it's also very romantic. So there's this very common merger of romanticism and scientism. And you see this in self-esteem to a slightly lesser extent, but it's you see it a lot in happiness discourses and in well-being discourses, and in mindfulness discourses, this like romantic look back to the past. You know, there was this moment in the past when everything was perfect, and in the pre-capitalist past, and they don't say medieval times, but they're alluding to medieval times. Like, they'll talk about Aristotle, you know, and I don't mean Aristotle because obviously that's classics, but I mean the sort of Aristotelian influence on Christendom, which they don't realize. They'll just say like, oh, Aristotle had the right idea. And then like, I always ask, well, why Aristotle? So there's this sort of romanticism there, but it's always scientized. And so this kind of pseudoscientific underpinning is always there that says science confirms that this is the right way to live, that these monks had it right. And so there's this marriage of romanticism and scientism. And then, of course, it's an enormous and lucrative industry. So the sort of founder of really the sort of mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is really where the popular current came from. He, immediately was selling like CDs and stress reduction tapes, well, tapes, then CDs, and then books and all of this stuff. So it's also this huge industry, and that's the same for a lot of these kinds of fads. And they promise to be panaceas. So self-esteem promised that it was going to be a social vaccine. It was going to solve all these problems before they start. It was going to inoculate young people from future mental illness. And they said there was a science as hard as nails that underpins this. And of course, it came out that that the science was very poor. But that rhetoric of science is always there. And that's what's happening with mindfulness now, is that things are coming out now where they're saying, actually, the science that everyone was banging on about was very poor. But it doesn't matter, because now they have anecdote, and they'll say anecdote is enough. And besides, we're moving on to something else. So by the time evidence emerges, they've already moved on to the next fad.
Well, I'm actually kind of glad that it is a grift, rather than, because if it were the case that you could simply come up with a formula to allow people to live with a sense of security and happiness and safety in a society as broken as this one, and deal with it as a private matter, we would be truly screwed.
Well, here's the thing. I think a lot of people are fine. That's the interesting thing, is that a lot of people are just fine. I know. Even in a society as broken as ours. And how these things thrive is by creating a deficit. So people often think that this is about optimization, that this grift is always, I hate that word, grift. This is always going to exist because you can always be happier. You can always be more well. But that's not it. It's not that we conceive of ourselves as very, very happy. We could just be even more happy. It's that the discourse itself tells you that you will never be happy with, like, that it's human beings lack this. There's always like some deficit in human nature that says we can't do it. We need this to do it right. And modern life just makes it worse. And it's just like health, like 150 years ago, people considered themselves to be much healthier, like, because they weren't literally dying than we do today. Whereas now, if you give people surveys, they are much more likely to report a huge range of symptoms and pain and so on. And it's not that we are objectively less healthy than we were 150 years ago. Like, people would live, like, women would have uterine prolapse, for instance, after having children, and they'd be like, well, at least I have my health. Or like there's a story in a very good book called anyways, Barsky. It's a book from 1980s where he talks about this man who writing in his journal in the late 19th century, talking about gout, and he's like sitting there enjoying a cup of whiskey, and he goes, well, at least I have my health, and he's living with gout. But what happened is that health has become something we have to pursue. So you're less likely to conceive of yourself as healthy because you're not a vegan, or like you don't eat enough greens, you don't go to the gym, maybe you smoke, but there might be objectively nothing wrong with you at this moment, but you're a patient in waiting. Health becomes something you have to do all the time. So that's part of what creates this industry. Mental health is this thing you have to do all the time, to be thinking about. You have to buy all of these things. And it's like, there's an inconsistency here in this paper, or there's a potential inconsistency in this paper and in some of what I argue, and that I really don't like people fetishizing commodity fetishism. Right. That, saying like, oh, this love of commodities or this misunderstanding of commodities is ultimately what underlies social problems. My problem isn't necessarily that mindfulness is a commodity, or that emotional problems are commodified or created, then commodified. My problem is the story that it tells about social problems. Because I think at least when you buy an iPhone, you're not really telling yourself that you're doing anything else other than buying an iPhone. You're not like, oh yes, my life's purpose has been realized. You're like, and you might even be a little bit guilty. You might be like, I know I shouldn't be buying this new iPhone, but I'm going to. Ooh, I'm bad. But when you engage in some of these techniques, you are telling yourself, I'm not really part of this. I'm I'm better than this, I'm dropping out, or something like that. It's selling you a solution, I think. But then I think also that people are not necessarily buying into it. So it's the public discourse that I don't like, and that I am adding my voice against. I'm saying the problems that we have are not ultimately psychological. They are not rooted in human behavior and human mistakes and human nature. And that is the story that is being told. So it's that ideology that I don't like. And it's not necessarily that whole like industry that grows up. Although I think the industry is pretty interesting. And I think it's interesting also the way that it grows up as a solution to economic problems. So you have like all of these people that get tossed out of the labor market. You know, they close down steel mills in Wales. And they have this whole idea that like this well-being industry is going to create jobs for people.
How much time do you got, Ashley? Because I want to we got some questions.
Sorry, I'm just like blah blah blah.
No, we got some questions that are coming in, and so how much more time do you have?
About 20 minutes at most.
Okay, that's great. So yeah, look, I just one comment on well-being, and then I want to take these questions, but I'll just say that when I said before about I'm glad it's mostly grift, because and that you can't solve social problems through this kind of privatization of the issue and the hope that you can just help people feel better or be feeling more safe. What I meant was that if we could solve social problems simply by changing private individuals without changing the whole system, then we'd leave in place the things that are creating the immigration crisis, or the healthcare crisis, or the climate change crisis, or on and on and on and on. But I want to put the first question from. So I want to encourage people to use Super Chat if they want to, but also you can ask questions if you don't use Super Chat. And this person asks, why is it hard for us to debate Stefan? You and Vosh did well, but why does he always land on his feet? It's hard to say.
Cake always tastes better than broccoli? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I feel as though there are a couple of things that help him in these debates. One is that I felt like there were a few moments where I had him on the ropes a bit, and I then there was kind of a natural social pressure to then move on and to change the topic and to allow him to kind of recover, because you want both sides in a conversation to have enough social
neck wag.
Right. I mean, so there was that, and the other thing was that he could always just retreat into repeating his initial claim as if nothing had happened, and there's not a lot you can do about that except call it out. And if he keeps doing it and you keep calling it out, it starts to look like neither of you have anything to say. Mm. So I think that was what kind of happened to me. The other thing I think might have been a weakness, might have been a strength. There's always trade-offs with these things, is that I didn't have the intention of simply winning a debate, but I wanted to, I was just trying to communicate as much to his audience and to my own about what I thought the problems were with capitalism and what Marx was about, as I was trying to beat him. And that meant that, I didn't go after him as strongly as I might have at times, and didn't even prepare to do that as much. And so that might have given him a lot of leeway too. But that would be my answer. But have you had these kinds of debates with people where you feel like they did better than they should have given the level of the argument?
Always. Always. I've had lots of debates where I'm not really pleased with myself. I once debated somebody who was like a population, anti-population growth kind of campaigner, and I like made a personal kind of jab at him, and I regretted that a lot. But
no, he didn't. And as someone said, Stefan curb stomp Doug. That's just ridiculous. That's not at all true.
I'm going to go to the Ayn Rand Institute soon. I also had I did a lecture at the Adam Smith Institute. I I love arguing with people that I agree with. I love talking to people that I agree with. It's nice. It feels good, warm, snuggly. But you level it up a notch when you're standing in front of people who don't like anything you stand for, and you try to be civil and bring them over to your side. That's what I like. So my goal for the Ayn Rand Institute is to try and find some common ground. I read Atlas Shrugged, and I did find myself hating the sort of romantic anti-capitalist. There's something there. I'm going to launch off of that. But yeah, I think that always happens. And these debates are never satisfying, but they are important to the extent that you can have them. But it's important also to respond to people, to study bad ideas as well, and to show where they came from and why they have the appeal that they do.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that you don't need to walk like someone's talking about in the chat about the Peterson Zizek debate. I don't think this came anywhere close to that. But a lot of people didn't feel that Zizek was strong enough in that debate.
Really? I thought there was this meme. Did you see that with like the Jungle Book? And there's the little boy walking by, and it was like wayward youth. And it was like Zizek like burst through the door like this hilarious bear. Exactly like that. Like, all these like wayward youth are there. And then they see this commie in the flesh, and he's like your wonderful uncle.
Right. No, I think he did great. But there were a lot of people who were critiquing him from the left, saying, oh, he didn't go after Peterson on this, he didn't go after Peterson on that, he was too amenable on this, and I felt that the opposite. I felt that he chose his strategy well and did the right thing in the debate, and ultimately really very soundly won, but he didn't do it in such a way where Peterson had to, broke down in tears or started shouting, or it was a civil debate. And it was, at the time I said it was sort of like a psychological intervention for Peterson. I think that Zizek should have done more work in that arena. I feel very badly for Peterson, strangely, because, he's very unwell right now. He's got had a drug addiction, but in any case, it is not possible to do one of these debates and at the end have everyone agree, oh yeah, you did great, you did perfect, and you won, and you're always going to walk out the other side with their audience saying, oh, he was an idiot, and you're an idiot and you lost, and your side saying, well, they're an idiot and they lost. Or I think if you're on the left, it's like he's an idiot and you didn't do well enough is probably the universal.
I think these are maybe politically immature responses as well. You're never really going to win these kinds of debates. They're more like ongoing conversations we've been having for like 150 years, and for a short period of time we kind of give up on them.
So someone says, I just want him to be exposed for what he actually is. The same person, Patrick Miller, for what he actually is. Really interesting conversation. So sorry for interrupting. What is commodity fetishism?
Oh, commodity fetishism. So that's projecting onto commodities power that they don't have. So it appears as though their meaning or their value comes from within the commodity itself. So like mainstream economics understanding of the commodity, I think, would be a good example of commodity fetishism. The commodity has a power in of itself to elicit in you a desire that appears to be irrespective of history or social arrangements. I think that would be commodity fetishism.
Yeah, that's not Marx's understanding. Marx's understanding of commodity fetishism was different. The commodity fetish in Marx is actually material. So the social relationships between people really are mediated through commodities. It doesn't have anything to do with your subjective desire. But because that's going on, then the truth about your social power is obscure to you. So, a worker produces goods that he doesn't directly consume or have much of a say or any role in exchanging, and other workers do work and produce commodities that, again, they don't consume for themselves or have any real role in exchanging. And it seems as though then that the commodities are doing the work. These things arrive through the market as if by magic, and the real power behind them is obscure, not only to the community or to the world, but also to the workers who are actually doing who actually do have the power and actually do the work that makes the world function. So that's the commodity fetish.
It's important to add that the fetish is real, right? Like you can't undermine its power by saying like, oh, but really we have the power. No, the commodities really do exert power over us.
Right, exactly. They do. So we are empowering a system that then imposes itself upon us. It's not that we could just say, oh, now that I know that there's a system, it will go away. We then, once we understand that the system of exchange is dictating our actions, we then have the responsibility of creating some other form of life that we have more control over, to mediate our relationships, and that are the ones that are more directly social and transparent to us, I think. But Marx talks about the commodity fetish, and a lot of people take him to be saying what you said originally, which is, oh, the problem with the commodity fetish is that it creates unreal desires in consumers, and people invest it with mystical significance.
Yeah, no, sorry. To be clear, I wasn't saying that. I was saying that mainstream economics understanding of the commodity itself is seeing that commodity as having power in and of itself. And I'm saying they're making that mistake. Right. Instead of seeing it as part of social arrangements. Is that wrong?
Yeah, no, that's right. But a lot of people will look at the commodity fetish in Marx, and there's what's grown out of this sort of critique of consumerism.
Yeah, it's like, oh, you're fetishizing Nike or something.
Yeah. Oh, you think that if you buy Nike shoes, you'll run faster.
Yeah.
That kind of critique of commodity fetish, which is not what Marx was talking about. Let's see if there are any other questions. Well, someone says Doug needs sleep.
See, Doug doesn't have the benefit of makeup, so I also don't ever sleep.
Yeah, but I did get less sleep than I might normally get in order to jump on this live stream, and I am feeling a little bit like Joe Biden as I try to talk.
While you're looking for a question, there was one thing that I wanted to say that was different about, not to like go back through that big monologue that I just gave. But one thing that I thought was really interesting about the mindfulness issue was that it doesn't actually promise to solve social problems. And that's what I think is really interesting. Unlike the happiness discourse, which made enormous promises about the ability to solve basically the falling rate of profit, although they didn't realize that that's what they were saying. Like they're going to, we'll just turn attention away from economic growth. Just pretend it doesn't matter or exist. Mindfulness is interesting because they talk a lot about complexity and resilience. And so what is interesting about that is that they're starting to say that the world is so complex that human beings can't possibly understand it. And even those in power don't really understand it. We could all use a bit of mindfulness. The business leaders will talk about how they use mindfulness every day. And governments will talk about how the cabinet ministers are all engaging in 30 minutes of mindfulness training, because the world is just so complex that we can't possibly understand it. And what you can do is be resilient within your own sort of sphere to find what Kabat-Zinn calls it, he says, find a little bit of peace within the maelstrom. And that's what I find very interesting, is that it's this giving up, very explicit, not making promises to solve problems. And that's what I find really fascinating about it. And it doesn't even say that your own mind. So it used to be like, sometimes they would say like with resilience, like you can fashion yourself to be more resilient to the world around you. Well, actually, they're saying like even your own mind is not under your own control. The number one thing I kept seeing when I was analyzing the discourse was there's just so much going on in our minds. There's just so much, and we just have to shut it off because we can't possibly deal with it. Like our minds are depicted as totally disordered, and even that is out of our control. We'd have to back away from even our own thoughts. And that's what I find so interesting about it, is that it's not even like some diabolical plan, no conspiracy to give the world structure, no misguided quest for utopia, that it's just a futile attempt to secure an indefinite repetition of the present.
I got another question here. Doug, why don't you bring up the millions dead in the wars by the USA? Those are capitalist wars, or the weapons industry fueled by capitalism. Well, I'm assuming that you mean, why didn't I bring that up to Stefan Molyneux? And the reason I didn't in that context was because, again, I was not wanting to exchange complaints about violence with him. He had spent a long time, listing all the atrocities of communist regimes. I didn't want to give that narrative any credence at all by repeating it on the other side. I just wanted to. So my response was to say, look, there's one thing called modernity, or this quest for human emancipation. And it has been a process of crisis and conflict and violence all along. And you can point to the communist regimes and look at their body count, or you could look to the French Revolution, or you could look to U.S. imperialist wars. It's all part of the same project. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, can we transcend the system we're in, this creating these body counts, and actually achieve the things that we're supposed to have an ambition for? Or do we simply dig in and accept the violence? This was what I was trying to say at the time. I'm not sure if I said it as well then as I did just now, but that was my point there at the time. Yeah.
There's a question here. I can't put it up on the screen, but it says, Alexander Grant, why do you discount evolutionary psychology as a major explanatory factor for society and history? Why not start from the study of nature and extrapolate? There's a very good quote in a book by Plekhanov, where he says two things. Either human nature does not vary, and then it explains nothing throughout history, which shows us immense variation in ways of living and of organizing societies, or it does vary, and then it is the outcome and not the cause of human social evolution. In other words, there is no such thing as a human being that lives in a state of nature. All human beings are born into a society that precedes them. You're born into a language that you didn't create, cultural norms and practices that you didn't have any part in. You must learn those things during your socialization before you start to question them as an adult. But if you take this man as he is in front of you, or woman as she is in front of you right now, and you study this person, you will wind up saying that it is human nature to do all the things that this human being appears to do. And then you wind up naturalizing what are social and cultural categories. So you can see this, for example, with a lot of parenting research. A lot of parenting research is based on psychology, which is studies that are done in the West. But when you move out of psychology and you move to anthropology, you see enormous variation in the way that children are raised. And so while psychology will say, it must be a human need that you must do these things, well, you look in other cultures and you say, well, they don't do that. So, for example, we believe in the West that you have to talk to the baby all the time. They have to hear a certain amount of words. You have to be very invested in putting this information in the baby's head. Whereas there are some cultures where you don't talk to the baby at all, or very little for the first year of life. And they don't grow up to be, defective in some way. They grow up to be normal members of that society.
Don't you have to make sure that you turn the TV, the record player on, and to make sure they hear words?
Okay, no, because it has to be a back and forth, right? That's what they'll say.
Right. So someone says, Patrick Miller again. Thank you, Patrick, for the super chats. Thank you both so much. I'm learning a lot. Channels like yours help me get out of the alt-light rabbit hole. Thank you. Well, I'm glad to do that. And thank you again for your super chat and for watching. Let's see. One thing I'll say about child rearing and the kind of the industry offering advice and the different ideas that get put forward is that you don't even have to move from one culture to another to realize that what we take to be natural is culturally and historically dependent. I mean, when my son, who's now 23, was first born, we bought a whole bunch of parenting books, and what I noticed was that we had our choice of which philosophy or school or ideological perspective we wanted to embrace. And if we wanted to be the kind of parents that wanted to let our kid cry it out and you know, potty train him at 3 months or something, there were stacks of books that would tell us all about how the science is in and that's the right way to go. And if we wanted to carry him everywhere and put him and do co-sleeping and, you know, dote on him and give in to every whim of a toddler, we had stacks of books that would tell us that's exactly the right way to go, and the science is on our side. And in that case, we could even point to some Aboriginal people and say, look, they're natural and they do it this way. They carry their kid everywhere.
Yeah, but they also like 50, 60 people around all the time. Like even like in those cultures, you're not like face to face, one to one with this kid constantly. Like mother-child, father-child play is comparatively rare. This idea that we're supposed to be like playing with our kids. That's what they mean. Like attachment parenting has become that. Like it's become intensive parenting, in spite of the fact that supposedly it's based on anthropological studies.
Right. I know. We were all in on attachment parenting. We were, and
you had more than one child. My God.
Well, it faded. That idea faded as we had more kids.
Yeah, I don't think it's possible.
It was attachment parenting. The second kid, attachment.
I don't want to attract the attention of these people too, because there's like tribes around all of these things. There are whole areas of research that people don't realize are very, very politicized, and they're like random. So like nutrition research is highly politicized. Parenting research is highly politicized. So anytime someone says the science says, it's not people in white lab coats being, gee, I wonder what the best way to raise a child is. They have an axe to grind. It is extremely tribal, and it's like one of my colleagues is a breastfeeding researcher, and it is shocking the degree of like she's like no platformed and canceled and stuff for like random things. So you have to be very, very careful about claims to science in the public sphere, because loads of things are politicized.
So I got a super chat with a weird question. I'll flash it on the screen, although I'm irritated by it. Who funded Hitler?
Oh yeah, it's a good question, actually, because okay. I wasn't saying, it's a stupid question, obviously, but what I mean is I'm not saying like, oh, these people are like just doing mouthpieces of their funders, right? Oh, I'll just take this money. No, they already believe it. They believe in what they're doing. They believe in what they're doing, but they're attracted to these funders, right? Who want that too. And that's the way that it works now. Like if I could get funding to do research, I would do it. You would never force me to say something that I don't believe in, right? And that funder might have some reason why they want to give me money to do that. I've never got funding for anything, unfortunately, because I've not found somebody who's got a lot of money who wants to support Marxists. But what I'm saying is that what winds up happening is the money being offered is for bureaucratic purposes. And so it tends to attract people who are okay with that, who think that that's important. And attract a lot of research that does that.
I don't know the motivation behind that question, but that's a good enough
but what I mean is that that's a good point, because I'm not saying that that people are just taking money and then not believing what they're saying. They truly believe what they're saying. It's just that those are the people who get funding.
And someone else says Canada and USA funded him. I don't know. See, one thing that's going on is we're having our conversation, and then there's all these other conversations going on in the chat. So it's hard to know what the context is behind.
Well, we can wrap up our chat, and they can carry on in the comments underneath.
Okay. Yeah. Well, listen. Why don't we wrap it up now? And but I enjoyed it. I think I might go get another cup of coffee. Maybe I'll take a nap. Who knows? Yeah. But you helped me feel a little bit better about the debate. One thing before I let you go, we're going to be talking to Andrew Doyle together and coming up soon. Is that still going to happen? Do you think?
Yeah, we just have to set a time. He's very busy. I don't actually know him in person or Douglas Murray. I've never met Douglas Murray ever. I've met Andrew Doyle once. Obviously, I don't think that there are any positions on which I and Douglas Murray would agree. But I think Andrew Doyle's really, really intelligent. And he's not actually, I mean, he's obviously very intelligent. He's very funny. He's more intelligent than I think he lets on. So he'd be an interesting person to talk to. And that I think he could go into things very deeply.
That's great. So we'll have Andrew Doyle, and he was known for his tweets as a pretend social justice warrior.
Tanya McGrath.
Yeah. He'll be joining us on a stream soon, and you'll continue streaming. So keep looking for Ashley, and maybe this will become a regular time for you. Who knows?
Yeah, it's shaping up to be a good time.
Okay.
All right. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks. Bye-bye.